Okay, so we're going to begin today looking at... pass these around, please. Looking at a book called Derech Mitzvah, the section called Mitzvahs Haamonas Elokus. So just a number of introductions to explain what this is and why we're doing it, and then we'll begin. So this book is written by the third Rabbi of Chabad, the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek, without spending too much time on his history, although it's very interesting. Like all Rabbeim are obviously very important to the development of Chabad thought, and development of Chabad as an organization and as a mode of thinking. But Tzemach Tzedek is a particularly an important juncture. One could make the case that in a certain way, the Tzemach Tzedek begins the dynasty of Rebbes of Chabad. So just to explain that, so the Alter Rebbe, which we learned from this Tanya, that's the Tanya we're learning, written by the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman. He founds the Chabad movement. He's succeeded by his son, known as the Mittel Rebbe, Rabbi Dov Ber. And then he is succeeded not by his son, but by his son-in-law. And his son-in-law is the Tzemach Tzedek. His name is Menachem Mendel. He's called the Tzemach Tzedek, after his books that are called Tzemach Tzedek, morning. And it's from him that son after son after son after son is Rebbe until our Rebbe, which is son-in-law again. Now, the Tzemach Tzedek is a son-in-law of his predecessor, the Dov Ber, but he's also a grandson of the Alter Rebbe. So he married his cousin. His uncle is his father-in-law. His mother is his father-in-law's sister. Yep. Sorry?
So now you lost me.
The Alter Rebbe had more than one children, but more than two children. But for the purpose of this conversation, the Alter Rebbe had two children: a boy, Dov Ber, a girl, Dvor Leah. Dov Ber's daughter marries Tzemach Tzedek, who is son of Dvor Leah. Dvor Leah passed away at a very young age, and the Tzemach Tzedek was essentially raised in his grandfather's house. So although he's a successor of his father-in-law, he's also a direct successor of his father-in-law's predecessor, his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, which is where the name Mittel Rebbe comes from. Because when Tzemach Tzedek was a Rebbe, when he was a Rebbe, he probably had on paper the largest number of followers. Pretty much everyone in white Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, that region, anyone there, if they were a chassid, meaning if they were not non-chassidim, they were pretty much all chassidim of the Tzemach Tzedek. It didn't mean necessarily that they were major followers of Chabad philosophy. It just meant that they used the Chabad Siddur, Chabad Menhagim, and to whatever degree had some familiarity with Chabad ideas. So he was a very influential person. He wrote in Jewish law as well, halacha as well, not just in Chassidus. So his influence was very far-reaching. And again, so numbers-wise, he probably had the most Chassidim of all Chabad Rebbes, of any Chabad Rebbe.
Even up to today?
It's hard to know. Maybe today we're matching those numbers. The number-wise was then huge. It's like it was all of white Russia, which was a huge number of the Jewish people. And it changed, because once he passed away, he had more than one son who all took over, so it split Chabad up into a few different dynasties, one of which was Lubavitch. But there were other towns that had other sons who became Chabad Rebbes. Kapos, Liadi, Lyozhna, and those broke up into others.
It's any of the Chassidim that we know, like the Ger Chassidim?
No, those are, all these I'm talking about are all Chabad Chassidim. So there were Chabad Lubavitch, Chabad Kapos, Chabad, depending which city of which Chabad, of which of the Tzemach Tzedek's children he followed. So Tzemach Tzedek himself, his Chassidus, his followers all split up between his sons. And then Lubavitch is the one line that's still active today. All the others basically became inactive before the war already. For whatever reason, that's another part of history. Anyway, so the Tzemach Tzedek is again very influential and important Rebbe. Oh, so that's what I was saying before. That's why his father-in-law was called the Mittel Rebbe, because the Tzemach Tzedek, when he was Rebbe, again, had the largest following. So he was the Rebbe, right? He was the Rebbe at the time. His grandfather was the old Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, meaning the original, and then his father-in-law was the Mittel Rebbe, the middle one, between the old Rebbe and the Rebbe. That's the name Mittel Rebbe stuck. Right? So it just gives you an idea of the influence of his persona as Rebbe. It's like he was the Rebbe in Russia, and his father-in-law was the middle Rebbe, and his grandfather was the old Rebbe, but he was the Rebbe. So very, very powerful, very influential.
But he became Rebbe while his his father-in-law was still
No,
alive?
no. He was not.
He passed away, right?
That's right. He succeeded his father-in-law.
Okay.
He succeeded his father-in-law. Just giving you the context of the. So even though he succeeded his father-in-law, he was also a direct student of his grandfather, right? And in fact, and this is the point I was getting to, he wrote insanely prolifically, wrote tons and tons and tons, both in Chassidus and in revealed halachic responsa on all subjects. They're still read and studied today by pretty much everybody, on all kinds of subjects in Torah law. And if I remember correctly, based on when he passed away, which was rather old for those times, in his high 70s, maybe even 80s, which was very old for those days. And he started writing at a very young age. If I remember correctly, the Rebbe does a calculation for how many weekdays he was alive, including Saturday night, meaning Motzei Shabbos and Friday, and based on how many pages of writing we have of his, that he averaged 12 pages of writing a day. Something like that. Which meant some days I'm sure he wrote more and some days 0, but it's on average something like that. It's an insane number. And one of the earliest works he wrote, which was written somewhere between his ages of 12 and 23, we know this based on the fact that his grandfather had commented on this work. So one of his earliest works he ever wrote is this book called Derech Mitzvah Secha. Now, Derech Mitzvah Secha is Kabbalistic / Hasidic exposition on a number of mitzvahs. Including the mitzvah to believe in God, Haamonas, Elokus, and that's what we're looking at here. His exposition on the belief in God, mitzvahs, Haamonas, Elokus, the mitzvah to believe in God, and he's going to give the Hasidic explanation. So that's introduction 1, just to understand the historical context of what we're looking at, which is why we're learning it now, because it takes a lot of the ideas that we already learned from the Alter Rebbe in part 2 of Tanya and develops it even farther. So in a way, we're kind of drawing a historical line of intellectualism. We started from Rambam, then we skipped a lot of generations and went to Alter Rebbe, and now we're going to Tzemach Tzedek. And if we keep doing this and it goes well, I have an idea for what to do from the Rebbe, to bring it all the way down to the language of our generation. Yeah, so we'll kind of see how the same ideas get developed further and further throughout generations. Now the Tzemach Tzedek, and this is going to be introduction number 2, is actually going to fill in some of the gap between Rambam and Alter Rebbe. Because the Tzemach Tzedek stylistically is a unique style within the genre of Hasidic writing, and that, in a way, he's kind of a bridge between Hasidus and other schools of Torah thought. In fact, at least on one occasion I've seen, where the Rebbe recommends somebody who's uninitiated with the learning of Hasidus, but is initiated in the learning of other areas of Torah, to look at the Tzemach Tzedek's writing, specifically this book, Derech Mitzvah Secha, because it serves as somewhat of a bridge between the two groups of learning. And because of that, what we're going to see is basically like this. Firstly, it follows, as we'll see, the language and structure of the concepts that are laid out follows more classic Torah learning, where he's going to begin by quoting a bunch of other sources, ask a question, counterbalance with an answer, propose another question, counterbalance with another answer, cite to a different source which reconciles a different problem, kind of that sort of structure, which we didn't find in Tanya. And Tanya was much more just the flow of ideas and stream of consciousness type thing. One thing leads to another. Here it's going to be much more like Torah structured in the classic sense. So in that way, it works kind of like, it bridges between these two worlds of the other schools of Torah writing and Chassidus itself. There's that element, as well as specifically in this book, Derech Mitzvah Secha, the way he structured the book is as follows. Every mitzvah that he's going to analyze, he begins with first quoting a book called The Chinuch. The Chinuch is a book who I don't believe we know who the author is, but historians refer to it as the greatest bar mitzvah gift ever, because it's essentially a father who writes this entire book as a gift to his son on the occasion of his bar mitzvah. And the book is essentially a brief synopsis of all 613 mitzvahs, organized by the parsha. So open the book from the beginning, Parsha Bereshis, and it's going to have the mitzvah Pruruvu, the mitzvah to have children. That's in Bereshis. Noach, I don't remember if it has any, or which mitzvahs, and then Lech Lecha has a bris, and maybe others, and then it goes through each of the parshas and goes through all the mitzvahs until you have at the end 613 mitzvahs. And it's not like in-depth, detailed halacha, but like an overview. Here's the essence of the mitzvah, here are the general practices, and there's the meaning behind the mitzvah. So if you really want to have an overview of all of Judaism, read the Chinuch in English. You really get a whole overview of all of Judaism, because all 613 mitzvahs, its basic definition its basic practice, and its basic meaning. It's available in English. Right there in those five volumes in yellow. The book of mitzvah education, right? The book Sefer Chinuch. That's that book there. Start from the beginning, read through it, and you'll get a really good, full, solid understanding of Judaism.
And he wrote this for a bar mitzvah gift. It's the big bar mitzvah gift.
That's why I'm saying the historians refer to it as the greatest bar mitzvah gift ever. We know when it's written. It's roughly written in like the Spanish Golden Era, but I don't think we know who the author is. If my memory serves me correctly. Right, there's this. Aaron Halevi Ish Barcelona. Ascribed to, right? It doesn't say written by. Ascribed to Aaron Halevi of Barcelona. So I don't think there's any conclusive knowledge of who wrote it, to the best of my memory. Anyway, so the Tzemach Tzedek begins his discussion of every mitzvah with a quote from the book of Chinuch. Right? He cites the mitzvah number, and then quotes the Chinuch, and then we'll begin also with a brief overview of the various different halachic angles of the mitzvah, and then use that as his launching pad to Kabbalistic definition, and then go to the Chassidus, which kind of synchronizes the halachic and the Kabbalistic, and that's kind of his style of writing. And that's what he's going to do here with the mitzvah of belief in God, which goes for about 12 chapters, or 13 chapters. So
This is one chapter?
this is chapter 1, which is kind of introduction. It's actually before chapter 1. It's the prologue.
Prologue.
Yeah, it's introduction to chapter 1. So that's introduction number 2. Number 3 is the mitzvah is called mitzvahs Haamonas Elokus, which means the mitzvah to believe in God. Key word there, believe, Haamonas. So this entire essay, this whole 13 chapters, is essentially going to help us straddle the line between faith and knowledge. What do we know about God, and what do we believe about God? Right? Which is kind of it's going to be in the border in our own minds of what are the things we can understand and what are the things that we believe and why we believe them, and also within God himself. Something we touched upon at the end of part 2 of Tanya, where we talked about the meeting place of the infinite and the finite, and how the finite and the infinite meet in this world called Atzilut. And we spoke a little bit then about the Rambam versus the Maharal, whether we're giving the definition of God beyond intellectual being or God as a perfect intellectual being, and how we understand and reconcile that. There's going to be much more language from the Tzemach Tzedek on that subject as well. That's going to be the whole subject here, is how to straddle between faith and knowledge in our relationship with Hashem. Now, finally, considering the thing we're developing in our knowledge of all this stuff, we're going to start, at least this week, we'll try to stick to actually reading the text. So you have it available here in front of you in English and Hebrew, thanks to Chabad.org. Actually, thanks to Sichos in English, which I recommend browsing their site, sie.org. They have probably the greatest library of Hasidic teaching in English available on the internet.
It's amazing.
So
with the Hebrew, though. It's amazing.
Yeah, so it's side-by-side Hebrew and English. So I'm going to read the Hebrew. You can follow the English, and we'll see how this works. I think we've come far enough that we can do that. Okay, so with that, let's begin. Oh, and it's connected to Shavuos, which is coming up, because the mitzvah to believe in God is in Shavuos, is in the 10 Commandments, the first of the 10 Commandments.
It's perfect intro.
So that's...
We're building up.
Yeah. Okay, so let's begin. And again, as I mentioned, he begins with quoting the Chinuch, this book, which lists the 632 mitzvahs organized by Parsha. So it reads, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, I'm God your Lord. This is, of course, the opening lines of the 10 Commandments. Asher Tzitzicha Meretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of the land of Egypt, Mebeis Avadim, from the house of bondage. End quote from Scripture. Comments the Chinuch, Zoi Mitzvahs Aseh, this is a positive commandment, Leida Lahamen Sheyesh Elokah. To know and to believe there is a God. He says both of these. We're going to explain these at great length, what that means, to know and to believe, but he mentions both as part of the mitzvah. To know and believe in God. Right? He's quoting where it's from. Chinuch, Parshat Yisro, Mitzvah Chafhem, the 25th mitzvah. So if you started counting mitzvahs from Parshas Bereshis, the 25th mitzvah is going to be, I am God your Lord. All right. So we're establishing, using the Chinuch, that it's a mitzvah. And the mitzvah is two things. Number 1, to believe in God. Number 2, to know God. Now, continues the Tzemach Tzedek. V'harambam b'sefer ha-mitzvos. The Rambam in his book of mitzvahs, by mitzvahs asay siman aleph, in positive commandment number 1. So just to comment on the disparity here, the discrepancy. The Chinuch calls it mitzvah number 25, because again, the Chinuch is structured that it follows the order of the parshas. So you start from mitzvah 1 in Parshas Bereishis, and you get to mitzvah 25 here in Parshat Yisro, and it's I am God your Lord. Rambam, however, has a book of mitzvahs, not his book of halacha, separate book called the book of mitzvahs, written way earlier. His book of halacha, which is 14 chapters, was, I believe, the last book he wrote towards the end of his life. The book of mitzvahs was written earlier, and if I remember correctly, was originally written in Arabic. And it also lists all 613 mitzvahs with a brief overview of what the definition of the mitzvah, similar to the chinuch. It precedes the chinuch, actually. Oftentimes the chinuch relies on the Rambam Sefer Mitzvahs, brief definition of the mitzvah, the meaning and a brief description, and so on.
Is that the Sefer Mitzvahs?
At Sefer Mitzvahs. It's not the same book as the book of halacha. Mishnah Torah is where he has a different count of 613 mitzvahs. Sorry?
Is that the 13 principles of faith that you say?
The 13 principles of faith come from an earlier work, his commentary to the Mishnah. Actually.
But that's
Also
not-
written in Arabic.
The 13 principles of faith, is that a mitzvah?
Not necessarily, we'll discuss them
Okay.
actually.
Okay.
We're going to discuss that, whether those are mitzvahs or not, as we'll see in a second. So, his book of 613 mitzvahs, Rambam's book of 613 mitzvahs, is not structured following the parsha, but rather, it's hard to know exactly what a structure is, but essentially a structure is like in foundation and in purpose of the mitzvah, if you will. So the first mitzvah is going to be belief in God. And then
Almost like a logical.
it's a logical sequence rather than chronological as it appears in the Torah. Right? So for the chinuch, it's going to be mitzvah 25 because he's going through the order of the parshas, whereas in Rambam, it's mitzvah number 1. Okay. So Be'er in mitzvah b'lashon hazeh, he explained this mitzvah in the following manner. Quote, now quoting Rambam. Mitzvah aleph, mitzvah number 1, is the commandment we have been instructed with respect to the belief in God. V'hu, and this is, continues Rambam, shenamen, that we should believe, doesn't mention to know, but to believe, sheyesham ila v'siba, there is a primary cause and reason, hu payol l'chol ha'nitzayim, that effectuates all that exists, or brings everything into being. Payol l'chol ha'nitzayim, he affects all that exists. So he gives us more definition. Chinuch just said, no one believes there's a God. Well, what's God? Didn't say. Rambam gives us a definition. To believe that there's a primary cause that affects and moves all existings. Okay, so it's a leader of creation, a master of the universe. It's a definition. And this is the meaning of the verse which says, I am God your Lord, ad kan l'shoneh, end quote from Rambam. Okay, so we'll note 2 things. Number 1, Chinuch says, know and believe there's a God. Rambam only said believe. Even though I should say in parentheses that in his book of halacha, he does say the mitzvah is to know there's a God, not just believe. And at least in his book of mitzvahs, he only says believe. That's number 1. Number 2, Rambam at least gives us a little bit more of a definition of what we're believing in, not just God, or alakah in Hebrew, but it gives us a definition of a primary being which causes everything to come to existence. Something which, when we learned way back at the beginning, Rambam's book of law, he had some more definition to explain that, the primary being from which everything else comes, and so on and so forth. Okay.
Just curious,
Yeah.
if you would put both know and believe as the first mitzvah, it kind of feels like it shouldn't necessarily be like there were other things that God asked to do before. But if it's just about believe, you think Abraham, before anything started, the first thing it was that Abraham believed that there was a higher. So, you know,
Did Avram Avinu believe or no? It's a good question, right? Because he used his rationale. Okay, we're going to develop some of these ideas as we go forward. Yeah. Okay, so that was Chinuch and Rambam. Now he cites to a third opinion. Ramban, top of the second page. Shom Kosav, the Ramban, not Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, but Rabbi Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, overlapped a little bit with Rambam, but lives a little later. And the Ramban wrote glosses to the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvos, arguing and disagreeing wherever he does.
What's glosses?
Like notes, annotations. Not annotations, like a comment.
A glossary. Yeah.
No, it's called, I don't know, they translate it in English, and not really. In Hebrew, it's hasagas. Hasagas, hasagot.
It refers to and summarizes.
Hasagot? Like hasaga is comprehension, like hasagot is like, they're like notes, so they're comments.
Commentary.
Comment. Yeah, so it's like on the margin of a book you write your comments on something.
Mm.
That's what he did. So either agreeing or disagreeing with Rambam wherever he feels he wants to comment.
Well, a glossary is usually found at the end of a book, and
Right, that's why it's not-
But it takes a simple concept and it elaborates.
Yeah,
on
that's not what he
the
does. That's not what he's doing. That's not what I mean here when I say gloss. It's always translated as glosses. In Hebrew, it's called hasagas or hasagot. Anyway, it's a running commentary essentially, and oftentimes you buy the book of mitzvahs from Rambam. It's going to come along with Ramban's comment in the bottom. Okay, so Ramban Shom Kosov, the Ramban comments on this mitzvah to believe in God. B'shem Baal Halachas Gedolos, quoting from a book called the Halachas Gedolos, which is a book written in an earlier generation. We'll leave that alone, what this is. So the Ramban comments on the Rambam quoting the Halachas Gedolos, another book. In brief, we're just going to call him Bahag. Baal Halachas Gedolos, Beis Hey Gimel, Bahag. That's as referred to. So the Ramban writes the name of the Bahag, Shaloi Mana B'Taryag, that he does not include the belief in God as part of the 613 mitzvahs. It's not. Why is that? So he explains. It would seem that the opinion of the Bahag is as follows. She'ein minyan taryag mitzvahs. We should not include in the count of 613 mitzvahs ela gzerosav yis'ala, only God's commandments. Shegazer aleinu lasos, which he has instructed us to do, aymano shalei lasos, or has told us not to do. Aval amuna b'mitzias yis'ala, but the belief in God's existence, shaydiyai sanu elenu, which he informed us of his existence, but oisais and moisim, through signs and wonders and miracles, ubegilei hashchina leinenu, and by revealing his presence to our eyes at the Sinai, who ha'ikr v'hashayresh is the primary source, shemenenu nolda ha'mitzvahs, from which the mitzvahs then stem. Lodim nu b'cheshbon, we're not going to count that in the number. So to explain.
Who's saying this? The Ramban?
The Ramban is quoting from, paraphrasing the Baal Halachas Gedolos, the Bahag. So just to explain the position here. We know we have 613 mitzvahs. Now, if you read the Torah from beginning to end, it doesn't exactly say, it doesn't number them. It doesn't say 1, 2, 3, 4. So we know we have 613 mitzvahs from the Gemara. The Talmud tells us we have a tradition of 613 mitzvahs. The Talmud itself doesn't list the 613 mitzvahs.
So no one actually broke it down until the Rambam, right?
He wasn't the first one, but there was like an era. It started somewhat before Rambam and ends a little after Rambam, in which a bunch of scholars sat down, okay, let's go through a whole Torah and see if we can find all 613 mitzvahs. Right? And it's like a whole genre of Torah study, including the Chinuch, the Rambam, and the Bahag, the Baal Halachas Gedolos, and other works that have used their scholarship to try to list all 613 mitzvahs. So it's not as simple as you might think, as it might seem. For example, Torah says build a temple. And then Torah says build a menorah, build an altar, build another altar. Are those a bunch of different mitzvahs? Or is one mitzvah build a temple that includes all these different details? Or are they all specific mitzvahs? That would change the number drastically. Right? Or another simple example is God said put on tefillin, on arm and head. Is that 2 hand mitzvahs or 1 mitzvah? Right? So it's not always so obvious how you qualify what constitutes one of the 613 mitzvahs. Another example, Torah says multiple times, thou shalt be holy. Is that a mitzvah? And what is that? Or is it just a general kind of statement that when you do all these mitzvahs, this is what you're going to become holy? Or is there some sort of active mitzvah that's called thou shalt be holy? It's not always so clear what the 613 mitzvahs are. So there's often dispute as to, does this qualify as a mitzvah or not qualify as a mitzvah? And in fact, Rambam, before he lists the 613 mitzvahs, gives a bunch of principles by which he determines what's considered a mitzvah or not. Right? So Rambam clearly does believe that "Thou, I am God your Lord" is a mitzvah, right? But listen to the phrase of the verse: "I am God your Lord that took you out of Egypt." Where's the instruction? Where's the instruction there?
It's very vague.
There is none. It's an introduction. Hi, my name is God. I took you out of Egypt. That's a commandment? Says Baal Halachas Gedolos. No, it's not. It's God introducing himself. And now that we know who he is, now he's going to tell us what to do. Or another way to think about that is, if there is no commander, there is no commandments. So commandment number 1 is to believe there's a commander. Who commanded you?
What about,
You already know the commander. If you're listening to the commandments already, you already know the commander. So commandment number 1 is to know there's a commander. Hello, he's talking to you. Is he not?
So why are those the first of the commandments on the Lumos?
right?
Which is why Bahag would say it's not. So how do you get on how do you get to
We
10?
get on 10 commandments.
That's
Obviously,
correct. The 10 commandments have to be 10 commandments. We know this also from the Talmud.
Yeah.
Meaning one could say, well, there's only 9 commandments on the 10 commandments.
No.
Because number 1 is introduction. But they reconcile that otherwise because commandment number 2, which says not to believe in other gods, has a bunch of details. For example, it says don't believe in other gods, do not bow to them. Well, maybe that's 2. Now you're back to 10. When you take out what we call number 1, and that's introduction, introductory remarks. Okay? So now we have our dispute already. Is belief in God a commandment, or is it an a priori before commandments? Right? It's almost like a halachic analysis, Like, are you yotze the mitzvah of belief in God? And how are you yotze? How do you fulfill your obligation to the belief of God? Or is there even an obligation? Whatever that means. That's the dispute here.
And it makes perfect sense, because if you think about it, you can't start doing commandments until you know where you stand, so
Correct.
to speak.
Correct.
Where you stand can't necessarily be a commandment, or else, like, the whole thing, it
correct.
doesn't,
But
yeah.
a person can get the schar and a mitzvah without doing it.
Okay, so you could argue that. You can make the case, right? All of these things you're mentioning are all discussed in the commentaries, all surrounding this whole discussion. Logically speaking, there is no mitzvahs unless there's a commander already. So commandment number 1, to believe in the commander, is like circular logic. I'm already talking to you, so you believe I'm here. Otherwise, what are you listening to? Like, oh, you didn't give us a commandment to believe in you, so I'm not believing in you. That's ridiculous. If I'm listening to all the commandments, I know you're there, so I don't have to have a commandment to believe in your existence. It's already there. It's baked into your understanding before we start doing any mitzvahs. Right? On the other hand, you can argue, well, it's true. It's obvious that there's a commandment. Nonetheless, Hashem is commanding anyway. That way we have the merit of the commandment of believing in Him or whatever. And we're going to see soon other reconciliations to exactly qualify how the mitzvah works. And maybe the mitzvah is to know certain details about God. Right? Not just that God exists, but certain details about God. That could be a commandment. So I know there's a commander, but what do I know about him? And maybe the mitzvah is to know things about him. Right? Like Rambam said, to know there's a primary being. Okay, so I know there's a commander, and the commandment is to know that this commander is a primary being, which brings everything else into existence. Okay, so now we have some commandment. This is what we're going to develop over the next little while.
Also, what about the context overall? Like the way it's presented in Parshas Yisro, like it starts at Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Like there's also like the general vibe of it, which is you're being presented with a commandment.
Right, translate the words. Where's the commandment? Hi, I'm God, your Lord, who took out of Egypt from the house of bondage. There's no commandment in that statement.
Yeah, but
then there is do not have any other gods
the whole
before.
thing. Like I think you have to see it in the context of it all, which is in the parsha how it's presented.
So that's how Chinuch and Rambam would understand it, right?
Yeah.
But just the counter argument is the words themselves don't imply any instruction. It's just an introduction. Hi there, I'm God. I took out of Egypt. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, if it was in Bereshit.
Right. Okay.
That's what I'm
maybe.
like.
What do you say about Bereshit?
Like if it was the beginning of the book, where the book introduces itself by saying, "Hi, this is God. I created the world." Then maybe there's no commandment. But considering it's in the context of
He's giving
the Torah,
there's the 10 Commandments.
Okay.
It's there in the first one.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot.
maybe
of
that's how
reasons to
Rambam. That's how Rambam and Chinuch would argue the verse.
But this can't be the only mitzvah that isn't explicitly commanded in the Torah.
There are, yeah, that's a good question.
It does make a lot of inferences.
Okay, very good.
That we
So
learn, right?
that's not a very simple question to answer, because not everything that's implicit in whether we can count that which is implied by Torah Sheba'al Peh as part of the 613 mitzvahs is a very hotly debated question. Like whether we can do that or not. Like when you want to count the 613, not that they aren't obligatory, but whether we count them as a biblical commandment is not exactly so simple.
What's an example of that?
What's an example of that? Prayer, actually. There's no verse that says, "Thou shalt pray." There's a verse which says, "Serve God," which our sages interpret to mean to serve God. Ezo avodah shebelev. Sorry,
Yeah, I was going to say that.
that's a verse in prophet, not in Torah, not in the 5 books of Moses. That verse.
You know, we don't have the Mitzvah.
Yeah.
So
Very good.
So
But where's the commandment in 613? In other words, by saying it's not a 613 commandment doesn't mean it's not an obligation. It's an obligation. It's just a question of whether it qualifies as one of the 613. It's not so simple. The verse reads, "Serve God with your heart." Our sages comment, what does it mean to serve God with your heart? That means prayer. So when the sages say that, are the sages saying this is the meaning of the verse and therefore it's 613 commandments? Or are the sages saying, no, you have to pray to God and we're going to hinge it on that verse? And if not necessarily is it part of the 613, even though you have to pray. That's an example. It's not a very simple thing to go through the mitzvahs and define them as 613. It's very difficult to do so.
So in the Torah it says serve God with your heart.
Yes.
Is that what it is? So it really could be. You could
Right,
just
so it
live
could be-
life with
Exactly.
the love of God.
Exactly. Exactly. And prayer is part of that.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's one of the 613 mitzvahs to pray. Not necessarily. Right? Again, there's arguments on all sides of the coin, which is making the point that it isn't always so simple to qualify what the 613 are. Starting with belief in God, as we
And
see
also
here.
there's Daraisa and Darabanan. Like, wouldn't you be able to say, okay, Daraisa is you have to pray in whatever form you want, and then Darabanan is Min Chamar.
Rambam would say something like that, yeah. Rambam would say the essence of the mitzvah is to communicate to God on your level, and then their sages gave it framework and timing and all that. Yeah, Rambam would agree with that. Others disagree with that.
Meat and like, there's so many things where we
Correct.
we extrapolate.
Correct.
And
So what's biblical, what's rabbinic? Yeah, these are all very good points discussed. A huge super lens. There's actually a great book also, more modern. This one, the Encyclopedia of Taryag Mitzvahs. It's not complete here. We only have volume 1 and volume 3, but volume 1 here is Mitzvah 1 to 24, just to give you an idea. And it goes through all of these questions on each particular mitzvah. It's a really masterful work. And to the best of my knowledge, made by a team of scholars. It'd be hard to imagine that it's written by one person. It's mammoth.
So the Bahag has a list of 613 mitzvot.
Does.
Explicitly commanded, do this.
And
don't do
and
this.
it excludes belief in God, because that's an introductory remark, not a commandment, because there's no instruction. It's something that's already known to the listener before God commands anything.
But
Yeah, it's an a priori.
In today's day and age, do we believe in the same 613, or there's like different
opinions?
There's still different opinions.
Different opinions. Yeah. Sorry?
I think that's crazy. Like,
It's pretty crazy, yeah. I'm not going to open up the whole can of worms, but there are those who reject the notion that there's 613 at all, actually. And they say it's one opinion of the Talmud. You don't have to take it. There are those that are of that view also. Although it's become widely accepted, everybody believes it's 613 because it gives us a structured number to work with. If you throw out the 613, we don't really have a structured number to work with. Right? You come to any arbitrary number that you come to when you're counting the mitzvahs in the Torah. But if you have the number 613, you have a number of framework to work with, and then it's like reverse engineering. You have to find what fits in, which is why it's the most widely accepted view. But again, all these things are disputed. Yes, it's pretty wild. Okay. So let's continue then. Which says v'nismach, I guess it's fourth to last paragraph in Hebrew. V'nismach sham, the Tzemach Tzedek continues, that there, the Ramban relies upon ma'mechilta. In Midrashim, we're called the Mechilta, where there it says, quote, Kashem shekibalta ma'chusi, kablu gzeiraisai. The Midrash there says, without getting into the background of the Midrash, but the Midrash essentially says, gives an analogy of God as a king who arrives at a town and he, conquers the city. And then his advisors say, okay, instruct the people on what to do because you're now king. And he says to his advisors, hold on a second, first accept me as king, and then then I'll tell you what to do. If you don't accept me as king, what are we doing? And that's the quote here. Kashem shekibalta malchusei, now that you've accepted my sovereignty, kablu gzeiraisai, now accept my instructions. So asu, our sages in this midrash, kabbalas hamalchus in mifnei atzmai, they made the acceptance of God as sovereign an independent matter, and the commandments which are decreed by God as a separate matter. And therefore the idea that God is sovereign comes before commandments, distinct from commandments. Okay, so this is the Ramban quoting from the Bahag, the Baal Halachos Gedolos. Nonetheless, last line, continues the Tzemach Tzedek. Dasa Ramban ba'atzmai, the Ramban himself, Hikar Rambam, follows Rambam, that it is a mitzvah. Ukamosh Yisayim Sam, top of the third page. Ukamosh Yisayim Sam, as he concludes there. Zeu das Baal Halachos Gedolos, v'yesh leponim. He says, Ramban continues and says, we're quoting the Ramban, this is the opinion of the Baal Halachos Gedolos, the Bahag, who thinks it's not a mitzvah, and he has yesh leponim literally means there is a face to it, meaning he has an angle, he has a perspective. But when it comes to my commentary on the negative commandments that do not have any other gods before me, I'll explain my opinion there. End quote. Now, continues Tzemach Tzedek, and in the Tzemach Tzedek, in the Ramban's commentary to the negative commandments, negative commandment number 1, which is do not have any other gods before me, He states explicitly that he agrees and concurs with the Rambam's position. And this is a quote. Quote, the first commandment is to accept the sovereignty of heaven. Meaning to say, that we believe, we should believe, or instructed to believe, says the Ramban, that there is a God who causes all of existence, who brings all of existence to being. He brings them into being from the absolute nothingness, elayesh, into somethingness, shehem love, that in which they are to be seen at the moment. And he brings everything into being to whatever state he desires it to be, at all times, at whatever time it happens to be. Vahusha Amar, and this is the meaning of the verse which reads, which he may be blessed and exalted, says, I am God, your Lord, who took out of Egypt, be based out of the house of bondage, end quote. Shia mitzvah ba'amuna k'moshe kosov, which is the mitzvah to have faith in God as written in Torah. And I have proved this, continued the Ramban, quoting from our sages, that it is indeed a mitzvah to believe in God. Specifically, the fact that our sages tell us that there are 10 commandments on the tablets, and you get the 10 by making mitzvah number 1 to believe in God, without getting into details of that whole proof, but he proves that. He said that Torah, we have been commanded in this belief, which is the foundation of our Torah. End quote of Ramban. This is relevant to us. Okay, so we have the majority opinion, Ramban, Chinuch, that it is a mitzvah. Bahag, with his counter-argument, it's not a mitzvah, it's a priori.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Isn't the definition of mitzvah to connect?
You're giving a very Hasidic, Kabbalistic definition.
Oh.
On its most basic definition, it means commandment.
Okay.
Just, we're approaching it halachically, almost, right? Like, how are you young to the mitzvah?
Okay.
Yeah, like, almost halachically. Okay.
Which is the negative commandment that Ramban was commenting?
Do not have any other gods before me.
Okay.
Rambam, right, Chinuch goes by order of parsha. Rambam goes sequentially in order of preference. So he starts with all the positive and then the negative. So mitzvah 1 and mitzvah 1, the positive and negative, are going to be the counter. Belief in God, number 1, the positive. Do not have any other gods before me, in the number 1, the negative. And that's where Ramban's 2 comments come from. Where on his positive commandment, he makes mention of the Bahag's position, but then in his comment on negative commandment number 1, he states his own position in concurring with Rambam that there is a mitzvah to believe in God. Okay, we be clear so far? Is there more time, or do we stop here? You tell me.
But that's number 1, though, right? It's the same. The first commandment is both in a positive and a negative form, right? It's
2 different mitzvahs. It's 2 separate mitzvahs in the 613. Yes, it's very common.
No, but
Rest on Shabbos, do not do any work. 2 different mitzvahs.
10 commandments, is it not number
It's 2 different
1?
mitzvahs? No, it's 1 and 2.
It's 1 and 2.
1 is Anochi, I am God, positive. 2 is negative. Do not have any other gods before me. Yeah, it's very common you have 2 like that. Rest on Shabbos, do not work on Shabbos. They're 2 mitzvahs, right? Positive, negative. Many such mitzvahs like that.
Shabbos is not one mitzvah?
No, it's 2 mitzvahs. Rest on the Shabbos, and do not do any work.
So then, because my question is then, how could you accept the second mitzvah of do not have any other gods with me without the first one? Like,
So again, let's make it clear. Bahag is not saying there is no God.
oh, I understand.
Right?
I don't know.
He's saying you already know there's a God, so it's not a commandment, right? Commandment number 1 is don't serve other gods. In other words, as long as it's an instruction, there's a commandment. If it's not an instruction, it's not a commandment. Says Bahag. If there's no instruction, it's something you know already. You have to know this before the whole mitzvah begins,
Got it.
which is going to be a very serious problem, so to speak, that someone is going to use as a launching pad to say, okay, if there's a commandment to believe in God, then that means there's something we're being commanded we didn't know already. Because if we already knew it, it's not commanded to us. You already know. So what didn't we know yet about God? And that's where he's going to use that as a launching pad. So, okay, so what can we logically deduce about God? And then there's a commandment to believe something beyond that. And then he's going to go and say, well, if we can figure that out on our own, then that's also something we knew already. Then the commandment is to know something beyond that. Well, if we can figure that out on our own, then the commandment is going to be beyond and beyond, beyond, beyond. So he's going to constantly be pushing the limits of what we know and say, well, if we know that already, then then we already know it before the commandment. The commandment must be something else. Right? And that's how he's going to develop this whole thinking. Yes? You have more time, or we pause over
I
here?
don't know.
What time is it?
It's 10:22. How much do you
We can finish the paragraph. We have a few more minutes, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's read that quickly because we're kind of making the point already. V'chein kasem meforish b'Ra'im Hemna. So it is stated explicitly in the book called Ra'im Hemna, which is a section of the Zohar, Parshas Va'era, Daf Chaf Hey Amud Aleph, in Parshas Va'era, page 25, side Here's the quote from the Zohar. Ala pasuk on the verse, Yidaitem keni Hashem Elokechem. You should know that I am God your Lord. Okay, so the Zohar quotes a different verse. All the sources we quoted so far cite to I am God your Lord as the foundation of the mitzvah. But the Zohar quotes a different verse, which reads, and you shall know that I am God your Lord. So you see here, the language here is instructive already.
Yeah.
And you shall know. There's instruction. It's not just introduction, I am God. It is instructive. So says Zohar in Aramaic, Pekudada, this commandment, Kadma d'chol pikudim, is the first of all commandments. Leminda, that it should be known, that we know, the ishlita ilah, there is a supreme ruler, and he's the master of the universe. Ubara alman kulon, and he created all worlds, Shemaya va'ara, heaven and earth, v'chol cheloid, and all that's in there. And this is the general commandment in the general sense, etc. Continues Zohar. Kivin diyada pekudada ba'orach klal. Once you know this mitzvah in its general terms, that there is a creator and he runs the world, then we are enjoined to know it in detail. The details about God's running the world. Kihu Hashem hu Elokim da'orach b'prat. To know that God is Lord, the level of Yud Kei Vav Kei is connected to the level of Elokim, something we developed a little bit in part 2 of Tanya. We're going to leave it alone because we're going to revisit it later in this work. Right, so there's knowing there's a rule of the world, and then there's knowing details about the rule of the world. Okay, this is the Zohar. And continues the Zohar, Kama Razim V'Sisim Isbei, there are many secrets and levels and mysteries to this mitzvah of knowing that God is the ruler, and what that means, that Hashem, God is Lord, and what that means, what's the difference between God and Lord, and why they're all one, etc. Something, again, we developed at great length in part 2 of Tanya. So, Ad Kan Lashon Le'Inyanenu, end quote from the Zohar as is relevant to our discussion. So, Mevorah V'Dvarav, it's clear from his words, 4th to last paragraph, that the first commandment in its general terms, he mitzvazu is this mitzvah, Haamonas, to have belief in God, Shemanar Rambam Pasuk Anochi, which Rambam lists, citing a different verse, I am God your Lord. But they both come to the same conclusion, that there's a mitzvah to believe in God. Now, that's as far as the general mitzvah goes, to believe there's a God. But then afterwards, Mashakos of that which the Zohar states, Ba'orach prat, that in detail one should know God is Lord. So generally to know there's a creator, more specifically to know that God is Lord. He mitzvahs achdos Hashem. That is already referring to the mitzvah to believe in the oneness of God. You'll remember from when we learned Rambam way back that there are 2 mitzvahs. Belief in God, which is to know that there's a creator, and then there's belief in the oneness of God, that God is in a comprised unity, but an absolute unity, as we explained at length. Right? So when the Zohar divides it into 2 sections, know the mitzvah in general, there's a creator. Number 2, you should know in detail that God is Lord. That, says Tzemach Tzedek, would be parallel to what Rambam refers to as the mitzvah of knowing God's oneness. That God is Lord, it's all one. Right? Here?
So which one is the Zohar talking about? He's talking
Mitzvah,
about the
Zohar,
oneness or
both. 2 mitzvahs.
But based on which, these are different psukim?
But quoting different verses. Correct.
But he only quotes one verse. He says,
Yes. Oh, okay, so good point. The Zohar divides it not into 2 mitzvahs, but 1 mitzvah, but general and specific. General, know there's a God. Specific, know the nature of God, that he's one. And Rambam divides it into 2 mitzvahs. Know there's a God, God's oneness, 2 mitzvahs.
And so he uses 2 different verses.
Correct. First of all, I'm God your Lord, for the mitzvah to know there's a God. And then, what the Zohar says, to know in a particular way that God is Lord, that is parallel to the mitzvah of the oneness of Hashem. Shemana Rambam Shem Siman Beis, which Rambam lists as mitzvah number 2. Pasuk from the verse, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Here Israel, God is our Lord, God is one. Same point, but making into 2 different mitzvahs, yes. Okay.
So Shema Yisrael is the basis for oneness.
For oneness, in Rambam's view. So let's make that clear then, yes. So Rambam has 2 mitzvahs. I am God your Lord, belief in God. Hear Israel, God is the Lord, God is one. Mitzvah of oneness of Hashem. That parallel of 2 mitzvahs would be followed by Ramban and Chinuch. Okay. Bahag says, no mitzvah at all to believe in God. We already know that before you started. Zohar says, these 2 things, belief in God and the oneness of God, are actually 1 mitzvah, coming from an entirely different verse. You shall know that that I am God your Lord. But we're dividing it into the general sense. God is creator, and the specific, God's oneness.
But it's still 1 mitzvah.
It's still 1 mitzvah.
Okay.
Yeah?
The general and specific is 1 mitzvah.
That's 1 mitzvah. The
Correct.
Zohar is one
In Zohar, it's 1 mitzvah, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, good point. Top of last page. The book of Chinuch lists mitzvah number 417, the mitzvah of I'm God your Lord, Hear, O Israel, God is our Lord, God is one, Shema Yisrael, God's oneness, right? Because again, chinuch goes not in order of preference, which would make it mitzvah number 2 as Rambam does, but he lists it according to the parshas. So Shema Yisrael comes way later in the Chumash, and therefore it's mitzvah number 417. Now, v'cheinu lehedje b'akdama zezayah daf beis amud beis. The Zohar elsewhere in Parshat Bereshis, page 12, side A, there it says Pekudat Lisa or Pekudat Riva. There it actually divides into two different mitzvahs, mitzvah number 3 and mitzvah number 4. Shem.
Last week, the Zohar originally you said what?
The Raya Mahemna, that section of the Zohar.
One, so what is he dividing in 3 and 4? Now I'm lost.
Mitzvah number 3 and 4, but it's 2 different mitzvahs is the point.
Of what?
Mitzvah number 1, belief in God. Mitzvah number 2, have no other gods before me. And, no, sorry. Yeah, and 3 and 4 are... he puts them in a different order, but mitzvah number 3 is belief in God, mitzvah number 4 is the oneness of God.
Okay.
In this other section of the Zohar.
This is in Bereshis.
In Bereshis. It's 2 sections of the Zohar. One's called Raya Mahemna, one's called Zohar, and they can sometimes have different authors, actually, different people speaking. So in Raya Mahemna, it states it as one mitzvah coming from I am God your Lord, and in the Zohar Parshat Bereshis, it divides into 2 different mitzvahs. Mitzvah to belief and mitzvah in oneness.
So when
We're not going to get down
this
the details of all
states
this. It's not so important.
explicitly, this
Sorry?
is on the verse Shema Yisrael, right?
Correct, yes,
this
yes.
He's saying on
Correct.
Shema Yisrael, there's 2 mitzvahs.
No.
There's the third and the fourth.
No. That the mitzvah, whereas the Raya Mahemna section of the Zohar puts belief and oneness as one mitzvah,
Oh, okay.
the Zohar in Bereshis divides into 2 different mitzvahs, mitzvah number 3 and mitzvah number 4. That's the
So
point.
there's only one opinion that it's only one mitzvah.
Yes, it's not going to be so relevant. He's going to mention it later. It's not going to be so relevant to our discussion further.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Raya Mahemna was maybe not saying necessarily this is the source for belief in God. He was just
It
saying
would
this
seem
is
like
one
as a mitzvah,
here.
it seems like he is saying
He
that.
is?
Yeah. Anyway, in conclusion, Shem Beis mitzvahs Elo Haamonas Elokus Vayichud, mitzvah 3 and 4 in Bereshis of the Zohar is the 2 mitzvahs of belief in God and God's oneness. Yoyin Sham seen there. Okay, so in conclusion, we can read the synopsis here that Chabad very nicely provides for us. The Tzemach Tzedek raises a question: is faith in God considered a mitzvah? Rambam and the Zohar considers it as one, as a mitzvah, while the author of Halachas Gedolos does not. Raya Mahemna and Rambam make a distinction between faith in God and the belief in His oneness, as count the latter as a separate commandment. It shouldn't say Raya Mahemna; it should say Zohar Bereshis makes it 2 separate commandments. Okay, we're clear so far. So this is going to be our launching pad. Now that we have all this down, as we go into chapter 1 and we go forward, we're going to start developing. So, what do we know about God? Like, if we're going to take the Bahag's supposition that knowing the commander is an a priori that comes before commandments. That means even before you open Torah, or at least before Torah tells you anything about God, you already know something about God. So what is it we know about Him? And then what is it we're being told? Okay, now you're commanded to believe. Or you're being commanded to know. So what are we to know? What are we to believe? And what do we know before? And that's going to help us develop more and more language into understanding God Himself. A lot of it which is going to end up where we started with in part 2 of Tanya. But again, as I mentioned, he's going to fill in a lot of the gaps from earlier generations about how they address this question. Because, of course, Tzemach Tzedek is not the first one to address this question, and neither is Alter Rebbe to address this question, what is the nature of God, and how do we exactly define that? There's going to be generations of thinkers before, and the Tzemach Tzedek is going to give us a lot of that information as well. And we're going to kind of systematically develop our understanding of defining, if you can, what God is, or at least defining what belief in God is.
Is it possible that there are multiple sources, like aside from Anochi, Hashem Lakecha, could there be other places that they bring this? Because
Yes.
the Zohar is saying Veyadata. So like you're going to kind of put it together and you say this is the foundation of
Yes, there are.
belief.
There are certainly other verses. For example, most notably, V'yadaita hayom, you should know today, V'ashevei salvachan, take to heart, Kashem hu Elokim, that God is Lord, Ein oid, there's no other. Right? What does that mean? There's no other. What does it mean? I'm God your Lord. That's another verse. And why the verse says take it to heart, right? That's the verse that the Alter Rebbe opened up with in part 2 of Tanya. And there are other such verses as well. They're
I'm
going to
just
be...
saying, could there be multiple verses that make for only one commandment?
Oh, yes, that does happen, yes. That could happen. That could happen. We have more than one verse indicating one mitzvah, not 2.
Yeah, so like maybe Anochi doesn't give enough information, but we kind of use
Yep.
another verse to kind of...
Yes, yep. Yep.
Okay.
Oh, so meaning when the Zohar quotes a different verse, it's not to
Yeah.
disagree with anybody. Yep.
Yeah, he's like adding. He's like also
Yeah.
Ve'adatim. It's like an added
Yeah,
idea.
you can say that. Doesn't have to necessarily be dispute as to what the source of the verse is. Yeah. Okay, so that's a little introduction, and God willing, we'll develop this further over the
Big
coming
topic.
weeks. It is
He's like opening the can of worms, like so
completely and fully. Yeah.
I'm just curious though, so the one who doesn't think that it's 2 mitzvahs but only one, where does he get another mitzvah from then?
That's always a great question. So unless the author himself goes through all 613 to explain them and which one they take out, it's a good question.
Yeah.
For example,
which is the one that they're omitting?
it's impossible to know unless the author himself goes through all 613. To give you an example, the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, part 1 of Tanya, lists the commandment to employ self-restraint even when things are permitted. Meaning there's nothing forbidden, but you should exercise self-restraint. The Alter Rebbe includes that as one of the 613 mitzvahs. Rambam does not. So which mitzvah of Rambam does Alter Rebbe omit to keep it the number 613? I have no idea. I'm just saying as a fact that happens. That happens in more than one occasion.
And where in the Torah is it written that there's 613?
It's in the Gemara.
It's in the Gemara, but it's not in the Torah.
That's why I'm saying there are other opinions in the Gemara which would, it's against by oral tradition, but there are those that would state that that's one opinion in the oral tradition and we can reject it.
No, but it's very, very widely accepted.
It's widely accepted.
Tradition.
It's because it's the
mentioned
only
many
explicit number.
times.
Because it's the only explicit number given anywhere.
Yeah.
And because there's no explicit counter opinion, we just assume that this is the opinion. Again, although there's other argue for whatever reason that there's a. How does he get to this conclusion? Because it says like this. It says, Torah tzivalona Moshe.
Yeah.
Torah was commanded to us by Moshe. Now, the word Torah doesn't mean commandment. So it should have said, Torah was taught to us by Moshe. But because it says Torah was commanded to us by Moshe, that means Moshe delivered commandments in the form of Torah. The word Torah equals 611.
Correct.
And because there's a verse which says that God himself said 2 commandments, 611 plus 2 equals 613. That's how we get to the number 613. Which means, when you come to the 10 commandments, 2 out of the 10 has to be explicitly stated by God. So if you're eliminating I am God your Lord, then where's your 2 that God himself said? So again, you have to take the commandment which says, don't have any other gods before me, and split it into 2.
So it is.
Right, so it makes it
That's not a
complicated.
basis
You just opened up
for
another
saying
can.
it is.
Correct. That's one of the reasons why Ramban, that's like the Ramban's proof to follow Rambam. Because the verse tells, our sages tell us, and there's based on a verse in Tehillim, that God himself told us 2 commandments. So the 2 are going to be, I am God, and don't have any other gods before you. It would sound logical, right? Because these are the most prominent commandments. I am God, no false gods. Everything else follows from there. So there we hear from God himself. And then the 611 we can hear through Moshe Rabbeinu. Great. Which is the basic understanding of what the Talmud is saying, which is why Ramban says, well, if that's the case, then belief in God is one of the 613.
Why do we care so much about the Baal? This
Baal Halachas Gedolos?
Yeah, like why is
Well,
it
he's
so significant?
very significant. Yeah, I mean, the Baal Halachas Gedolos comes from the generation, the post-Talmudic Babylonian generation, meaning while the Jews are still in Babylonia, but after the Talmud's over, the era of the Goinim, as it's called. It's a very important work of halacha that's still relevant actually till today. It's cited to as a source, a primary source. Okay, God willing, we'll continue
Thank you.
next
Thank you
week.
so much. Thank you.